It makes me sad to see some of my relatives that were in there are so sick with physical ailments.
I look at a picture and over half of them are gone.
I wonder about that sometimes. Why was I spared? Why am I still alive?
There's a growing health crisis in Canada's Indigenous community. The trademark of this crisis are evident in rising rates of poor health in Indigenous communities that are significantly worse than that of other Canadians.
It's not a health crisis for other Canadians or in the minds of other Canadians.
We approach healthcare for everyone else in Canada as though it's a human right, but for Indigenous people it's an act of charity.
Canadians don't rally behind First Nations in the way that they do other populations in Canada.
It's simple human wisdom that we can't heal from an injury unless we remove the source of the injury.
The health crisis in Indigenous communities began with government policies enacted during colonization. These procedures, based on a belief of Indigenous inferiority, shaped healthcare both on reserves and in residential schools. These practices, codified through the Indian Act and other legislation, remain an intricate part of Canada's healthcare system and widens the gap between access and quality of care for Indigenous people.
Just about for every health outcome, Indigenous people have higher rates of it. That's true for mental health conditions like depression or anxiety, PTSD. It's true for addictions issues. It's true for infectious diseases.
Death rates are much higher. Infant mortality rates, neonatal mortality rates, childhood mortality rates, suicide and violence in adolescence. Virtually everything we look at has a multiple of what we see in the rest of the country.
As the broader health crisis unfolds, 3 Indigenous women confront their own health issues in Canada, and in doing so, reveal the lasting impact of trauma on their personal, emotional, and spiritual well-being.
I contemplated suicide because I couldn't stand the pain anymore. I couldn't stand the nightmares. I couldn't stand that I had such low self-esteem.
All my dreams were gone. I knew I couldn't do anything anymore, or I know that I'll be a failure.
I still suffer those triggers, and anything can trigger an episode.
I started drinking, and I found a 40-ounce whiskey. I drank the whole thing. I almost died. I ended up in poisoning my system.
I've had insomnia for many, many years. I've lived with fear for many, many years.
When I heard the doctor say I was going to die, I started to cry. I asked Creator to give me a chance to say I'm sorry to my mom. I wanted to tell my kids I love them.
Like others in the Indigenous community, Victoria, Marlene, and Mary's health conditions share a common origin.
There's absolutely no question that the current health crisis occurring in Indigenous communities is directly linked to the residential schools.
Residential schools were born out of the Indian Act and a policy of assimilating Indigenous people, First Nations in Canada. It was born from a very troubling and problematic mindset that saw Indigenous people as being savage, being primitive, without place or purchase in a modern emerging Canada.
And central in those Indian Act policies were the authorized removals of children from their homes and enabling the government or Indian agents or religious officials to come in and actually steal the kids and put them into these residential schools.
We never knew when they were going to come to gather us all up to go to residential school. My grandmother would tell us, make sure that if you see the bus, if you see somebody coming, to go hide.
The truck came, it was a truck. There was a bunch of kids in there already. They were taking them to school too. Some were crying and some were, yelling, and some were fighting.
I remember just feeling, I just want to go home. I don't want to be here. Oh, where's my mom? Where's my granny? And then always looking out that window and crying.
It felt like a prison. You have to watch everything all the time.
How brutal it was that love between parents and children was attacked and deconstructed and severed through these residential schools.
These schools, scattered across Canada, operated from 1883 until 1996. They were funded by the government, but operated by various Christian denominations. By conservative accounts, at least 150,000 Indigenous children attended these church and state-sanctioned residential schools.
The intention was to turn them into people that would, I suppose, be visibly Indigenous, but would live according to Canadian values, Canadian practices, Canadian social norms.
We were looked at as non-civilized. In fact, that was one of the reasons to have a residential school like that, so that they could kill the Indian in the child.
Well, for me, it was just having no identity, just having that number. My number was 63. My hair was cut that first day, and if there's a death in your family, that's when you cut your hair.
Our hair was very sacred. I felt shame. I've never felt shame before.
Under the Indian Act, Indigenous children were considered wards of the state. This policy made administrators guardians over Indigenous children. In the absence of parents or proper oversight, these children experienced physical, emotional, and even sexual abuse.
Not only children being beaten severely to the point that they would be beaten so bad that they would, wet themselves or soil themselves, but that those beatings were done publicly where other children were forced to watch as a process of intimidation.
There are reported cases where hockey sticks, straps made of conveyor belts, and even homemade electric chairs became routine methods of discipline.
Then the lights would go off at night, and that's when the pedophiles and the perpetrators roamed.
He treated me really good because he said I was really smart. He used to always call me my little girl.
What I understand now was a grooming process, and she was very nice. She would show me her bedroom, and it just started from there.
Because early childhood trauma is the worst of all things in society. As a child, you are forming your primary view of the world, and you're forming your primary view of who you can trust, who you can't.
One time he said, if any of you have any questions, just write your name down on a piece of paper, and I could answer your questions in private.
He told me to sit down, and he started pulling my dress, my little dress.
When you put kids into a system that is inherently unethical or unjust, you see all sorts of terrible stuff happening.
He put me on that little like a little couch, and then he raped me. And he did that to me a second time.
And all of a sudden he came again just close to me, and he did this. Do not ever say anything about this. Do you hear me?
Early childhood trauma unleashes this whole lifetime's worth of survival or coping, really. You don't really ever get over that.
Expecting that people will move through the normal channels of growth and development after experiencing such trauma as children without any intervention for mental health or well-being is ludicrous.
Because these schools were underfunded, Indigenous children experienced inadequate medical care, poor nutrition, and lived in unsanitary conditions.
The health conditions got so bad in that schools, and the kids were literally starving to a point where they couldn't even complete a full day of study.
I remember feeling very stupid in school that I could hardly read and write.
Those in authority would often withhold food to manipulate and to control Indigenous children. The long-term impact of their actions helped shape, in part, the current healthcare crisis in Indigenous communities.
We could never have what we wanted. Like, if some kids didn't like porridge, but they'd force them to eat it, and they would just shove it in their mouth.
And where I was asked to stand on the table and say how sorry I was to the nun, the sister superior said, well, no one is going to have any supper. So what could I do? I said I was sorry.
I remember being locked in the attic with no food. I don't know how long I was there for, but I know I was there for a long time.
When you're deprived of food and certainly sleep, your physical symptoms are very pronounced as well. So your body just can't grow as well. Your brain can't develop in the same healthy way that kids who are nutritionally sound would do.
The prolonged malnutrition that First Nations people experienced in residential schools or on the reserves has some of the same effects as prolonged exposures to famine and directly increases the rate of type 2 diabetes.
Students were maintained in malnourished states in order to serve as a control group to test the efficacy of vitamin therapies and milk.
The stressful conditions in residential schools without buffers like connection to language, culture, and family made Indigenous children more vulnerable to illness.
If you have more stressors, then you have buffers, more trauma, then you have positive determinants of health, then you end up with this more negative health picture, and that can include higher rates of mental health diagnoses, of infectious diseases, of chronic diseases.
Many Indigenous children died in residential schools. The children were often listed as missing or discharged, when in fact their bodies were buried in unidentified graves at school cemeteries.
There's markers like crosses, and we were told those were veterans, but we knew.
Everybody knew about the graves, like, because that school was in a reserve.
And sometimes we did see parents come to the boarding school and say, where's my son, where's my daughter? And the nuns would get mad, had the nerve to get mad.
In 1996, the last residential school closed. Many generations of Indigenous children returned to broken communities with growing health needs.
Very often, they did not know how to live in a healthy way as an Indigenous person because those teachings had been taken away from them.
The parents really don't have the experience with parenting anymore because the children were taken away, and the children don't have the experience of being parented.
Broken family connections left voids in the lives of Indigenous children that were filled by negative social influences.
I was always getting abused, sexually abused, because I didn't have my parents there, and anybody can do what they want to me.
Oh, it affects us in every single way, like addictions, low self-esteem. You shouldn't fight with each other. That's the one that really makes me sad.
I didn't want anything in the world but to be part of the other, because I felt that I was the less other.
The passage of time can heal wounds when the underlying cause of the injury is addressed. Otherwise, the wound may disappear, only to reappear in a far worse form.
In more complicated scenarios such as youth suicide or youth hopelessness, that comes out of the deep level of trauma that continues to exist inside of communities.
But we can't call it post-traumatic stress disorder because it's not over. For these kids, it's continuous or ongoing or complex traumatic stress disorder.
And we're not talking about a single traumatic experience. We're talking being immersed for years in a traumatic experience, how that has led to diabetes, high blood pressure, high lipids, and ultimately heart disease.
Intergenerational trauma speaks to the effects that the trauma has on an individual being passed down to their children and their grandchildren.
When I got married and had children, I loved them, but I just did not know how to love them beyond when the school age. It was a trauma-filled life for them as well.
I felt really bad about was not being able to hug my kids because we were told in residential school it was dirty and I was perverted.
Look where we are. Here in the city of Winnipeg, for example, 10, 11,000 children, and almost 90% of them are in care. It's not because we don't love our children, we just didn't know how. That was taken away, it was stolen from us.
Everybody's now recognizing that pulling children away and then putting them in repeatedly moving foster homes doesn't bode well for their future.
The healthcare crisis facing residential school survivors and their families exceeded the treatment capacity on the reserves.
I think all of the areas are underfunded, so it makes it very difficult when you have members coming into my community and wanting services which I can't provide because I don't get the funding that I need.
As First Nations people, we have to advocate for our people to get these resources.
Soon, the healthcare crisis spread beyond the borders of the reserves.
The barriers are not just about geography. They're about the attitudes, the racism that people experience in healthcare settings that make them actually avoid healthcare settings.
It's systemic racism that we as a community have decided that there's part of our community that we can denigrate, underserve, and not take the action that would really be implied if any other community were so involved.
For years, survivors did not share their painful experiences or seek treatment for their trauma. A shift in this outlook occurred in 2008 when Canada's Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, extended an apology to Indigenous communities for residential schools.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history.
When we use words like genocide, and when that word is proven to be what actually occurred here in this country, it says that what we are dealing with is to a level and extent of seriousness that I don't even think most Canadians can even begin to understand yet.
We cannot be healthy in a society where people still say things like, why don't they just get over it? For so long as we're a society that tolerates that kind of thinking towards another group of people, we will never reach our full potential.
I think that's a facile argument that some use, like, let's move on. I didn't do this to you. It's not my fault. I'm not racist, therefore, the problem isn't mine.
You don't just wake up one day and recover from cultural genocide. You don't just snap your fingers and expect this stuff to go away.
Survivors are coming forward and sharing their stories as part of the healing process.
I got family counseling, I got therapy, just like there was a window open and I could see what I needed to do. Somebody had to raise these kids.
The patient is the center of our therapy, so that we aren't fighting over what we think is right. We're working with what the patient thinks is right.
that can translate is actually into respecting the right of self-determination for Indigenous people. So it's also a right of Indigenous people to use Western medicine as well as traditional medicine as they see fit. They don't have to choose one or the other.
Indigenous people find comfort in turning to traditional healing methods to reconnect to their roots.
We have a traditional healing lodge in Pine Falls. We have the sweat lodge in the community. We have Sundance leaders in the community that provide the services that people want.
I think we're looking at the whole person. So when we see clients that come in, we want to, obviously look at the body, mind, spirit.
And once they come here, then they feel good about being here. They feel like they've come home. But that's not to say that we don't work with the Western methods. I think there's a way to work with both ways.
Forward, and we're open to just closing those barriers, closing those gaps, and working on how to better serve the clients so that they can access everything in their home community.
This healing work cannot be imposed from the outside. It has to be community-led, and communities have to find their own path through this.
Our communities hold the knowledge and the solutions on how they can heal.
Funding programs created and led by Indigenous people helps break down barriers to change in healthcare.
So a lot of the work I do in Indigenous health is about putting some contextual understanding of their past and how they got to where they are today.
First Nations, provincial and federal government need to be in agreement about the kind of service model and the kind of funding that is required to meet that service model.
The Indigenous people have an equal right to the highest attainable standard of health, including the highest quality healthcare that can be provided under our universal public healthcare system.
Healing also requires more diversity in healthcare. Those administering the care must, to some extent, reflect the people they serve.
It builds an easier sense of trust that people taking care of you are like you.
And having a more representative workforce is one way to achieve that.
Frankly, indigenizing the rest of our community so that's how you start achieving more equitable access to the rest of us start understanding and recognizing the value of Indigenous people.
Mary, Victoria, and Marlene have found their individual paths to healing. Their courage, strength, and character in confronting their personal health crisis proves that healing is possible.
By reclaiming our language, the way that we used to do things, our ways of being and knowing, that because that was taken away, it was stolen from us.
So when I received my traditional name and I went back to the culture, that's when I knew who I really was.
By reclaiming one's language, culture, Indigenous health practices, and embracing one's name, the gaps created by colonization are mending slowly.
So I have two names. One is Wabinoa Wankwe, which is Morning Mist Woman, and the other one is Kimionikwat, which means rain cloud. When the rain comes down, it washes away the uncleanliness of Mother Earth, but it also washes away the hurts and the things that has happened to us, and I cherish both names.
Why was I spared? Why am I still alive? I really think what the work I'm doing now, that's why.
I thought I want to get unstuck. I don't want to be frozen anymore. And I got accepted into the Aboriginal Wellness Program. And I've been going to university ever since.
That's my spirit name, and it means woman standing in the universe. That's what I was given when I was 4 days old.
Indigenous people are resilient, strong, connected to culture, and will continue to exist despite discrimination.